So hello everyone, I'm Mary Tedrow. I'm the director of the Shenandoah Valley Writing Project. And if you are watching this video, you are here to see my presentation on looking past deficits. So I'm going to share my screen and we're going to get started on a few things. First of all, if you haven't done so already, I'd like you to locate the handout for this presentation and download it to your computer. You'll be using it in the course of the presentation. Since this is a video, you can pause at any time and get those tasks done. I do want you to understand that this presentation is interactive. If we were all in a room together, we would be writing and sharing face to face. Periodically, you'll see a slide that looks like this with the big purple pause button on it. That means that you should pause the video and then follow the directions for some writing and thinking. You'll get more out of this presentation if you take part in these activities. Then you can hang on to your writing and any questions they might generate, because those can be addressed in the live portion of the conference on Saturday, September 12th, when you can meet with presenters and ask them any questions that you have. So we're going to start right away with a pause button. I'm going to put a quote up on the next slide, and what I'd like you to do is write about your reaction to the following quotation. Before I move on to that quotation, I just want to let you know that writing before talking is a feature of every class that I teach. The next time you use the turn and talk protocol, try switching it to write, then turn and talk. Some of us take longer to formulate our thoughts, and writing, which is a distinct form of thinking, gives everyone in the room a chance to do that thinking and engage with the topic. We all know our extroverted students will have no trouble thinking out loud. Our introverted students, on the other hand, and I'm one of those, take a little longer to process our thoughts. And by that time, the extroverted student has already done all the thinking for us. So we never get to engage with the question or think about it. So the writing that you're going to do in this presentation is thinking writing. So you don't have to worry about correctness or things like that. So for that reason, I would like you to please stop the video, pause, and then do the writing activities. So here's the quote. It'll stay up on the screen. You move my video so you can see all of it. It'll stay up on the screen if you pause the video. This is by John Trudell, who is a Native American activist and a poet. He says, "When I was in high school, they drugged me into the principal's office and told me I had a lot of potential, that I needed to learn how to study hard and make something of myself. And that's when I quit school, because I realized that we weren't operating on the same level of reality. Because you see, I knew that I already was something." So here's where you pause the video and just write about your reaction, your thoughts, and your feelings to what John Trudell has to say. Okay, welcome back. When teachers share their thoughts around this quote, many of them feel that they are saddened that John was not valued as a person when he was in school. John Trudell, however, went on to be a poet, a speaker, and a great communicator. And he began his life by rejecting what he saw was the primary goal of education, which was to turn him into someone else. The goals for the activities that we're going to do today is to help you find out who your students already are by exploring their past, their current lives, and their attitudes and skills around the literacies that support these interests. James Baldwin also had a similar sentiment when he talked about recognizing the importance of valuing the lives and the experiences that children bring into the classroom and seeing those as a valuable resource. Baldwin said, "A child cannot be taught by anyone who despises him, and a child cannot afford to be fooled. A child cannot be taught by anyone whose demand essentially is that the child repudiate his experience and all that gives him sustenance and enter a limbo in which he will no longer be Black and in which he knows that he can never become white. Black people have lost too many Black children that way." Here, Baldwin speaks exclusively about African American students, but we know that we have a great diversity in our classroom who bring a home experience to us that may not match our academic community. If we honor rather than dismiss that background, we will encourage students to pursue their learning. So we're going to look at how we can both honor our students and help them move on down the road to improving their literate behaviors. So before we get started, I'm going to ask you to pause again and take just a few minutes to jot down your understanding of the levels of the ability of the students that you have and their access to standard American English in your classroom. So take a few minutes to jot some notes down about the students you are teaching, and then we'll move on from there. So John Trudell thought that school was trying to turn him into someone else. Baldwin thought that African American children were not acknowledged for who they already are, primarily because they were not speaking the standard American English. And as teachers, we need to consider whether it is our job to make our students into something else or to work with what they bring to us. So I am going to suggest that you take time in your year to inquire into the literacies that your students already bring to school and celebrate those practices and behaviors before you start working with them. Now, in a few moments, I am going to ask you to record how literacy appears in your life. But before we do that, I want to be sure you understand what I mean by literacy. I'm sure there are times when you might read for pleasure. Perhaps you have a book going, or maybe you have a magazine or a blog that you like to read. Maybe you read the news on at regular intervals. You might also have to read for information, maybe the news or some kinds of directions. Then there is the literacy that you employ during your workday. When during the day do you have time to read, or do you have to read as a part of your job? When do you write? What kinds of talk are you using through the day? I also want you to consider other kinds of reading. When you walk into a new environment, you probably read the room. Who's in there? How do they seem to be dressed? What is the grammar of the room? Grammar, by the way, means the underlying rules, and most spaces have some logic to them. A hotel lobby, for instance, you know there should be a registration desks. There's probably some seating areas, maybe an elevator shaft. Those are the expectations of a hotel lobby. This is also why we have to orient our students to the library so they understand how that space works, how to read the space of the library. This is also why I don't go into high-end dress shops. I don't understand or feel comfortable in the culture of a high-end dress shop. So when you read a room, you might notice whether there are places for sitting, for talking. This is especially apparent when you enter an eating area with open seating for the first time, like a cafeteria in a school. When you walk in, you read the area. Do some places look more dangerous than others? Maybe you go to a subway station and you find an area to stand. You're reading the people around you. Are there people who look friendly? Are there people who look frightening? The other is we also read clothing. Are there people who look like an authority? Is there a rebel, a fun person? There's all kinds of texts that we encounter throughout the day which require the same kinds of thinking that reading printed texts or visuals require. Maybe you have a religious or spiritual life, and there are texts that are a part of that life. There is reading and analysis of these texts. Maybe you are a musician or you have other hobbies. What in your household requires different kinds of reading and writing? Texting? Are there storytellers in your house? Who tells the stories and why? So I'm going to leave this screen up. Oh, sorry. This is another place for you to pause and take about 5 minutes to list as many literacies that you can pinpoint in your life. And I also want you to think about what literacies are you working on. For instance, I am working on online instruction. That's a new literacy for me, and as I'm sure it is for many of you. Maybe there are particular programs that are literacies you are working on. When you have the opportunity, compare these lists that you make with a colleague who has also participated in the presentation. So now you're going to take 5 minutes to list as many literacies that you can pinpoint in your life. So let's look at this idea of literacy. Because what we want to do is help kids recognize that they are already literate in different areas. Because literacy is best understood as a set of social practices. These can be inferred from events, which are mediated by written texts. There are different literacies associated with different domains of life. Kids who skateboard have a whole separate literacy. My grandson can speak to me about Roblox. You know, that's a Roblox language. But literacy has a social practice. You're using it in social activities. Literacy practices are patterned by social institutions and power relationships. Now, school has a very specific literacy to it, and there's a lot of power relationships in a school as a social institution. You probably remember from your own schooling, figuring teachers out what it was that was expected of you from this teacher as opposed to another one. Some literacies become more dominant, visible, and influential than others. In a school, the dominant is reading and writing. Less dominant is speaking and, reading and listening is dominant, but speaking and writing is not as dominant on the student side of it. Literacy practices are purposeful and embedded in broader social goals and cultural practices. So we may think that kids are not particularly literate, but if they have a purpose, they will do lots of literate behaviors outside of school. I had many students who wrote all the time outside of school because they were involved in fan fiction or blogging or some kind of social interaction. And then they would tell me they weren't writers. So the literacy practices are embedded in these social goals. It's also historically situated, and literacy practices change. We're all going through literate adjustments now that we are all trying to go online. They change over time. New ones are frequently acquired through the processes of informal learning and sense making. So we're all experiencing change in our literate behaviors right now. Outside of the fact that many of you are teachers, And you're probably involved in some of the same literate behaviors like reading and writing emails, writing newsletters to parents, or speaking in front of groups of children and adults throughout the day on a daily basis. If you shared your list that you made recently, you may find that you have a wide variety of literate practices outside of school. So what we want is to get the kids to see what they're doing outside of school and get them to tell us what they're doing so we can help them move into the academic literate behaviors. And we can build on those. So teachers will probably have similar lists of literate behaviors during the school day, but outside you might have personal interests or other practices that are controlled by the culture of your family. So how can we find out what kids can do or what they already know? One way, of course, that you can do is you can query them just like I have here. Ask them, what do you do outside of school that involves literate behaviors? And I do mean to ask them, you know, how are they good at reading situations? Are they good at reading people? Because those cognitive practices also will transfer over into reading practices. I had students who, by all school descriptions, would be called at risk. But when we read stories, they were excellent at reading character, far better than my honors students. And I think it was because they were so very good at reading people in their somewhat chaotic lives. If you are surviving in a chaotic situation, you need to be very good at reading people. So those are the skills we want them to recognize. So we want to ask them, you know, what's going on and treat their answers with curiosity and interest. In other words, honor their answers. So here is an activity that I have done at the beginning of a school year in order to get them to know me, but also to open the door so they can start describing their literacy biography. So this is an assignment I ask at the beginning of with my older students. You might want to consider how you might adapt it to your own students. So I tell them the story of my journey as a reader and a writer. Now, those are the topics that I teach in an English language arts classroom. So those are the topics that we discuss. So I take them through my slides, modeling for them and giving them the opportunity to think on their own about their own background. So I'm one of 5 children. I had an older brother and a sister. That's me right here with the little hat. My younger sister wasn't born yet, but there were 5 of us. I was highly motivated to read. Both my older brother and sister could read, and I wanted to be like them. They could read everything, and I felt like I was catching up. My parents read to us. My mother had been a teacher, so there were books in the house, and we were always reading. And these are the books that I remember from before I was able to read, books that were read to me. So Winnie the Pooh, our copy of Winnie the Pooh looked just like this. My mother read a chapter to us every night. Just So stories is an important memory for me because my dad read those to us, and that was unusual. So to have my father read a story to us each night for a while was a treat. There was a group of these childcraft encyclopedias, and my mother had them on a shelf that was low to the floor. And of course, now I know that that was purposeful, and I spent a lot of time looking through those. They had nursery rhymes, they had crafts you could do. There were a lot of things that I could look at. This book on the upper right, Ho Hum, was one that was read to me at bedtime. Both my mother and my grandmother had a copy of it, and it was brilliant. This little boy goes to the zoo, and he's so excited about going to the zoo, he skips his nap. And of course, he's tired. And as they go through the zoo, he says, ho hum, and he starts to yawn. And of course, everyone knows that yawns are catching. So all the animals start yawning, and he puts the animals to sleep. So as they go through the zoo, each group of animals falls asleep and the people are getting annoyed with him. However, for a child, as they said, ho hum, I would start yawning. And I can tell you that I looked for that book when my children were small, because of course they never want to go to bed, and I never found a copy of it. This other one, the bunny book, is one of the golden books, and I'm sure anybody my age would remember a lot of these, and they're still very popular. This was about what a bunny wants to be when he grows up, and at the end, he just wants to be a daddy bunny. So when my siblings had children, I always gave them a copy of this book. So that's fun to explore with the kids, what books they read. The next is the kinds of books I chose when I was and I'm gonna pause this, hang on. So this category are the kinds of books I chose when I could read. And this is fun to explore with the kids, like what are the books that you read when you were given choice? Ribsy, a Beverly Cleary book, is the first one I remember, first chapter book I remember reading on my own. And it was one of those books that I was sorry that ended. Some of you probably also read a lot of series books, The Secret in the Old Attic. These are important in the development of children because the books in a series are typically predictable, though the storylines change. And the predictability gives the children a safety, a certain amount of safety, but then they get exposed to a whole lot of vocabulary and a lot of text. For a while, I read a lot of historical fiction, like Little House on the Prairie books. And then once I discovered those, I went to that section of the library over and over again. I remember clearly reading A Wrinkle in Time by Madeleine L'Engle, and that was one of the reasons why it took me a long time to get around to the Harry Potter books. I didn't think they were nearly as exciting as that one was, but maybe it was just my memory of it. And then for a while, I spent a lot of time reading science fiction. And this was under the influence of my older brother, still one of my models, reading models even then. And I read a lot of Ray Bradbury books. Another category that I like kids to consider is books that they were proud to read. What are the books that you read that made you feel accomplished when you were finished? These books are up for different reasons. The first one, The Gone with the Wind, I remember buying that with my own money, and I had one goal when I went into the bookstore, which was to find the fattest book that I could find, because I wanted to carry it around and have people think I could read a big fat book like that. And by the way, I saw a lot of my students do this when they were given independent reading. Repeatedly, students who struggled would pick, what's the name of that book? It's a horror novel, but it's big and fat, and they would carry it around for like 3 weeks until it was too hard for them to read. But I knew why they were carrying it around, and I made no fuss over it because they wanted to be seen as a reader. So that identity is really important in their development. So Gone with the Wind was that for me, and I did finish the book because it was a great story. So I read all those pages, and I was extremely proud of myself for doing that. 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea was assigned to me, and I hated every minute of it, but I finished it. It was not a book I enjoyed, but I plowed through it, and so I was proud of myself for forcing myself through this book. And then Jane Eyre, I had a best friend. She and I shared a lot of romantic stories. I thought this story was so romantic at the time. I don't think so either, but it was a self-selected. I knew it was a classic. I wanted to be seen as somebody who read classics. So those were my choices for the books that I was proud to read. Another category you could ask kids to think about was that what's the last best great book you read? So here's 3. If you haven't read them. East of Eden, I don't know why we teach the Grapes of Wrath, because I think East of Eden is a way better Steinbeck book now that I've read it. Oh, my slide, sorry. I don't read a whole lot of YA novels, but Eleanor and Park was a sweet, lovely story. I highly recommend that. And then The Goldfinch, a lot of people compare this to a Dickens novel. So it's Dickensian in its scope. It's very long. So these are all great books. And getting kids to share the last best great book is something you want them to do, so that they are talking about books and that they're building this community of readers. So they're beginning to talk about their books. And then here's another category that's fun to ask kids about, which is what changed your life? Is there a book that changed your life? And I can say unequivocally that this one did change my life. I had to read it when I was a senior in college in a gym class. Yes, we had to read a book for phys ed, and it was about this new thing called aerobics. And in that class, I started jogging and I never stopped. I'm a walker now, but so it did change my life, changed my health and my scope. So reading can do that for us, and we can share that with our students. Then the other thing you want to ask kids to explore is their writing memories. These are mine. One of the reasons I wanted to write was because my mother said we could only have a library card when we could write our names. And my name was long, you can see it there, had lots of letters in it, but I was motivated. And as I said, she had been a teacher, so she knew what she was doing when she made these suggestions. I clearly recall being taught to outline before writing in elementary school. I think I was in about 3rd or 4th grade. I couldn't do it, and I cheated. I wrote the paper first, and then I wrote the outline. And guess what? Lots of people write that way. Not all of my writing memories are good. My handwriting was bad. I got a D in writing in the 5th grade, which was an embarrassment to me. But writing at that time on your report card meant handwriting. So I got a D. I remember at least 2 teachers reading my writing as a good example to the class. That was also embarrassing for an introvert. And then probably one of my first successes was having a poem published in the literary magazine in the 9th grade. Also in the 9th grade, I got a D on a creative writing piece, and it had the grade D and the word trite on it. The only 2 things that were written on that paper. So those are negative writing memories. And then in 10th grade, I won a radio-sponsored essay contest, and that is when I started to think maybe I could be a writer. So again, pinpointing these moments when kids start to identify with reader or writer are things that we want to do. So that's my literacy biography. So I want you to take some time to write out your literacy biography, because I want you to consider sharing your past as a model for the students. You can use the questions on page 7 of the literacy of the handout. Those are just a guide. You don't need to answer all of the questions. You can just select from the list and choosing the ones that make you want to write. So if you haven't thought about this for a while, that's what I'd like you to do now. So you can pause the video and use page 7 of the handout to write about your own literacy biography. Of course, if you don't want to use those questions, you can go through what I went through. What do you remember about reading? I think one of the questions in there is, when do you remember noticing reading? Not all of our students are going to have been read to, so they won't be able to list books that were read to them, but they can talk about things like noticing reading. When did they notice people reading, and what did they think about that? So pause the video and take some time to create a literacy biography. So what we want to do with the students, I hope, is to get them to tell you a little bit about their own lives in terms of their literacy, and to celebrate what they're already doing. Now, of course, it's not our goal to leave them where they are, but to acknowledge their current skill with a variety of literacies and to use that knowledge and those skills to move them into the dominant literacy that is represented in schooling. So we want to acknowledge what they already have going for them and then start pulling those in. And a lot of information about your students will help you figure that out. So here's some things you might want to think about in terms of what you're teaching. So how you can inquire into existing student literacy. What do you think they would need to help them fashion a literacy history? Now, in the lower grades, I've seen teachers have students create a portfolio of literate items. So the youngest of our students can bring things into the school that they are already using and working with at home. When they're older, you can have them actually write a literacy biography. And that means inviting in, video games and other things where they're interacting. So when are they speaking, writing, listening, and reading? And then what would you do with this information once you get it? These are the questions that I want you to have, that I hope you will think about once you start inviting students to share their literate histories. Okay, we have been doing all the writing that I've asked you to stop and do is what we would call reflective writing. And before I ask you to, let's see, stop share that. Before I ask you to write about your experience with the reflective writing that we've done, I want to, well, no, I do want you to do that. I'm sorry. Believe me, this is what I would do in person anyway, stumble around here. So everything that we have done so far is reflective writing. So what I want you to do is think about that experience of writing reflectively. What do you think is hard about writing reflectively? What do you think is easy about writing reflectively? So stop the video and come back. All right, usually at this point, I ask teachers to tell me what they think was hard about reflective writing and what they think was easy. Typically what I hear is coming up with the memories is hard, coming up with casting their mind back and thinking about something that they haven't thought about for a while is hard. Usually the writing itself is easy. So I do want to talk about reflective writing for a little bit, which is, this is a place where you can honor students' home languages, because what we expect you to do with a reflective writing is to put your thinking down on paper. So what we are doing is taking that voice that's in our head and transferring it to the page. That is why teachers generally don't worry too much about grammar, syntax, and punctuation and those kinds of things, because the focus of reflective writing is conjuring up the thoughts. And our students come to us already speaking a language. The language that they speak has a grammar and a syntax all of its own. It isn't wrong, it's just different. So reflective writing is generally easy because we ask them to write the way they think. Now is when I'm going to stop share, because I want to talk to you a little bit about how reflective writing helps us learn. So the things that you're asking your kids to write about is not just informational for you, it's helping them revisit experience and understand what they gained from it. So Dewey talks about this when he envisioned two kinds of thinking. There's one kind of thinking that's automatic adherence to rules, that originate from authority. So we do this all the time. We ask the kids to follow the rules. We ask kids to memorize things, spit them out. So that would be automatic adherence to rules. And the other kind is reflective thinking. So reflective thinking is casting your mind back on an experience and creating a meaning out of that experience. So what we've been asking you to do all through this presentation is to think about your previous experience and to write it down. Why do we need to do that? Because after we reflect on something, we are poised to take what Dewey called intelligent action. In other words, to make choices going forward about what we want to do next. So when we ask kids to reflect on their literate behaviors, then we're going to ask them to start casting themselves forward and what can they gain from what they already know and apply it to what they're going to do next. So opportunities to reflect arise from practical events. So you can ask kids to reflect on anything that happens in your classroom. You can ask them to reflect on a range of activities, and that will just bring the experience to the forefront and let them think about it. So in the handout that you have, there are tons of questions there about questions you can ask kids to get them to think the way we want them to think. One of my favorite ones is to look about your house, some reflective writing, and to get the kids to think about where can they do different kinds of reading in their house, and have them that as a homework assignment. So this is probably something they never thought about before, but you're offering the opportunity for them to look at their house. Where are some spaces where they could get some reading done? And then write about those spaces, and that will bring it up to their attention so that they can make choices going forward. So opportunities to reflect arise from practical events. When they're not prompted by teachers, as we have done, reflective thinking arises naturally when events leave us disquieted or confused, or maybe we are stopped by a sense of wonder or awe. That will make us reflect. But we want them to reflect on what it is we're trying to help them act with academically. So when you prompt reflection, it asks students to review events and ascribe meaning to them, and then to look forward by setting new goals and aspirations. And that's what we call learning. So I do want to share this other resource. Let me find hang on just a second while I mess with the technology here. So these reflective writing shows up in the Virginia SOLs starting in the 6th grade in the ELA standards. Personally, I think reflection should happen in kindergarten and going forward, getting kids to at least talk about events and think about what meaning they make from those events, and then starting to help them set goals for the next step. So I'm just showing you the SOLs here. And I've highlighted where reflective writing shows up. It starts at 6.7 and it's part of the ELA. This is the new standards, and it goes all the way through 8th grade, all the way through to the 10th grade. So if you are asking your kids to do things like the literacy biography, you've got them involved in reflective writing. And then you can also add to that the goal setting piece to move them forward. Okay, I'm going to show you another way that you can bring student literacy into the classroom for teaching. This is one of my favorite assignments I used to do with kids called Stump the Teacher. And this meant ask them to bring something into the classroom that they thought they could read well, but that I might have trouble with. Now remember what I said about literacy. It's contextual and purposeful. If I am into something, That thing I'm into is going to have a whole vocabulary attached to it. And the reason I'm going to spend a lot of time trying to figure out that vocabulary is because it really interests me. So literacy is purposeful, it's contextual, and our kids are doing it. And you just want to show them that they are doing it. So I taught at the high school, and if I were to ask kids to bring in something that they thought they could read that I couldn't, they might bring me something like this for fantasy football. And I would do a read aloud. And so I just found this article online, and it's about fantasy football. And what I would do for the students is try to read it right in front of them and do a think aloud as I did it. So for instance, I would say 2019 fantasy football draft prep. Oh, wait, fantasy football. Oh, my sons-in-law are involved in that. It has something to do with making up your own team, I think. I'm not sure whether or not you bet on it. I don't know if they actually play games, but I do know you put teams together. So anyway, don't want to draft list starts with Todd Gurley, Ben Roethlisberger. I don't know who that guy is. Okay, so this article is about fantasy football, and these are people you don't want to draft. And I think drafting means putting them on your team. So the subtext says, who are the players you should avoid at their current ADPs? What is an ADP? I don't know, but I'm going to go on and see if I can get any clues. Dave Richard shares, I don't know who Dave Richard is, shares his annual don't want to draft list to help you eliminate mistakes on draft day. Okay, I get that part. This guy's going to help me out and keep the losers off my list. So here's some simple draft advice. Don't draft players you don't buy into. Okay, that makes sense. Simple philosophy, right? Fantasy football is about building and maintaining a team with players you believe in. Why louse it up with players you just don't think are going to be great? Right, simple. Every year I release a list of players who I'm avoiding at their current average draft position. Average draft position. Wait a minute. ADP, average draft position. That's what ADP stands for. But I don't know what an average draft position is. Okay, so you get the idea. You go through the reading and you show them how you try to make sense out of what you're reading. And of course, this models for them that even a teacher could have difficulty reading a text. And what are the tools the teacher uses to read the text? And in the meantime, you're also getting a student to bring in some of their literacy into the classroom. So you can celebrate that and let them see how each of these things are going to bring them along. So Stump the Teacher's fun because the kids are the experts and you are not. And I think that opens them up to understanding that everybody has to work on reading throughout your life, which is true. Okay, so I want to talk for a minute about the handout. If you look through that, what I have included there are lots of questions to get the kids to do this kind of reflective writing over their reading and writing habits. Also, their habits as a student. Anytime you want to get them to buy into academic behaviors, you can ask the question and have them write about it. So you'll see some models in the handout for those questions, and of course you're going to want to adapt those to your grade level. Now, if you're in the content area, the kinds of reflective questions that you want to ask them about have to do with your content. So I've asked students to tell me their literacy biography, like where did you come from? I've also asked you to think about how are you using literacy outside of the classroom? What are the things you're good at? Even if you aren't an adept reader, maybe you're really good at reading people. Those are things that you can tell me about. So if I were a math teacher, I might ask you something about where is math showing up in your life? Where do you use numbers? And I don't play fantasy football, but I suspect there's a lot of math in that. I suspect that's as close as I can come to it. If I were a science teacher, I would want them to reflect on their experiences with science, maybe where science shows up in their life. This is another way to bring interest in. The other thing in the handout are interest surveys. Um, and you always want to get the kids to reflect, ascribe meaning to the experience, and then goal set. Move it forward into the goal setting. That's my presentation. I hope you gained something from it. If you have your writing and you have questions and ideas to adapt the activity, bring those to the live session and we'll talk about them there. The last thing is, remember, we're looking beyond deficit. So you had a list that you made at the beginning of where your students have gaps in their learning. That typically is what we look at. What did they not have? What are they not bringing to the table? These assignments ask us to discover, what do they have? What assets are they bringing into the classroom? And how can we all learn from these assets? So I hope you can enjoy finding out more about your students, and I'll see you in the live session.